Hi, my name is Wendy Ann Clark, and this is my channel Transformation, where I talk about how God desires that we would be transformed into the image of Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit. So my goal here is to bring teaching that I hope will help and encourage you to cooperate with the Holy Spirit and to be changed. And today's the day that I answer a common question, and today's question is, why does God let his people suffer? And one of the oldest books in the Bible, the book of Job, talks about what is probably the most controversial thing about God, that he allows suffering. In the book of Job, the why question suggests that God has perhaps missed something along the way. Didn't he know that Job was faithfully serving him? Job's friends seem to think that Job must be overlooking some sin in his life to be suffering so much. But Job doesn't think that is the answer. So what is going on? And God doesn't answer the question of suffering with a lengthy explanation. Instead, he answers the question with himself. He answers with his power, his authority, his wisdom. He says things like this. He asks Job questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you ever in your days commanded the morning light? Where does light live, or where does darkness reside? Can you lead out a constellation in its season? And this goes on for a very long time, that God asked Job very pointed questions. And then Job responds. He says, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. Essentially, what God says to Job is that Job can trust him because of who God is. He is God. God doesn't promise an escape from suffering. He promises to be with us in our suffering. And is that enough for us? To know that the God who created all things and commands all things and is good will go with us and will use suffering for our own good? And I know this is not a satisfying answer to anyone who values a life free from suffering as like the highest goal, like they're just going after a free and easy and good life. But who would we be if we never experienced any suffering in our lives? A life free from suffering sounds good in theory, but suffering is what produces character and strength in us. In James 1, 3-4, James writes this, for you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. I see how suffering brings compassion and mercy, and it spurs us on to acts of love and kindness. And how would we ever move beyond self-focus without suffering, whether that suffering be emotional or physical or mental or spiritual? To trust God is to trust that whatever suffering I experience is the suffering I need in order for God to shape me and to grow me spiritually, and for God to do his very best in my life. God is always good, and any suffering he allows in my life is good. It's going to bring about good in my life. Ultimately, it's for my good. God not only uses suffering to shape me, he also uses my suffering to shape others as well. God is always maximizing his kingdom purposes in every bit of suffering, issuing invitations, drawing people to himself, stirring people to spiritual growth, rescuing people from sin and death, and bringing new life. Now, I know some argue that because God allows suffering when he has the power to prevent it or to stop it immediately, that must prove that God is not good. But to live an easy life free from all pain and suffering and then die in sin and be spiritually dead and separated from God for all of eternity, that wouldn't be a gift. That wouldn't be a blessing. And if God were to allow this, then he would not be good and merciful and gracious and compassionate. God is expressing who he is by allowing us to suffer and using suffering to bring good and holding us through our suffering. So I encourage you to go back, read or reread the book of Job, and pay attention to what God is telling us about himself, about human beings, about suffering, about restoration. Wow, something weird happened to my thing. Why does Job suffer? I can't read this. Why does Job suffer? And why does his suffering stop? Why does it finally come to an end? And what does Job learn along the way? What is going on with Job's suffering? That's a study that you should do. If you've never done it before, then you should do it. And if you've done it before, then you should do it again. Start looking, go through Job, the book of Job, and look at the friends that talk to Job, that God is displeased with them. When you get to the end of Job, he says, Job needs to offer a sin sacrifice for them because they were wrong about who God is. And then there's one friend that God is pleased with what he says. He's right about who God is. So you should go back and read, what is the difference? And one difference you will find is that there's friends who think that Job is suffering because of his sin. It's that question that the disciples asked Jesus when they encountered the blind man. Who sinned, his parents or him, that he was born blind? And Jesus says neither. That he was born blind, that God might display his glory in his life. Job's suffering seems to be along the same lines, that God might display his own glory in Job's life. But Job learned something along the way. And then look at how God multiplies what Job had. What happens to Job in the end is he sees a multiplication. It doesn't take away his suffering. It doesn't take away his pain. He still lost children and many material goods and flocks and all kinds of things. But I think of like the children being the hardest part. He loses them and he gains more children, but they're not the same children. They're different children. But of many things, he receives double. Of people, he doesn't receive double. But of material possessions, God doubles what he had before. So what is this all about? Why did God want us to read the story of Job? So when you go back and read it, think about that. Think about what God tells us about himself, what God tells us about human beings, what God tells us about Job and his friends, about sin and salvation. What do you learn about who God is and how we ought to live? And what do you learn about suffering? I think Job, the book of Job, is to teach us something about suffering. I hope you found this helpful. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you liked it, hit like. If you think somebody else would like it, please share it. Hit subscribe if you just want to help me on YouTube. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I post new content. And thank you for watching, and see you next time.